Antiquity Unveiled, the most marvelous revelations of the 19th century concerning the origin of Christianity, by Jonathan Manning Roberts. And let's see if we can finish Zoroaster, Zarathustra, Zerdusht. And I'm sure there's some other variation that someone can think of. It is most probable that this delightful country was none other than the beautiful valleys in what is called the hill country of India. In all probability, the scene of the first perfect civilization of man, the great center from which all subsequent civilization has radiated all over the world. There we are told, actually it's closer to Afghanistan, the 200 something sounds that humans make, but 40,000 years ago, kind of proliferation from that point. The great center from which all subsequent civilization has radiated all over the world. There we are told, he went up into a mountain and was led by the veiled hand of Bahman through throngs of attendants to the throne of Ahura Mazda, where he obtained the Zendavesta, or sacred book, which has been attributed universally to him. The mountain he ascended was the mountain of the wise man, where was located the great central seat of Brahmanical lore. From there, he returned to Persia, his mind enriched with the treasures of knowledge acquired during his abode in that center of spirit imparted wisdom. It was there, no doubt, that this glorious and immortal medium was impressed by great and good spirits and found a new religion, which would give a more spiritual interpretation to the import of material things that he found among the learned Brahmins of India. At that same time, not wholly ignorant of the sun worship and star worship of his own people and country. Well, not being a part of it, but definitely addressing those things, right? Because he received revelation, and he was inspired, directly inspired, which the word's kind of not used too well. Completely different from founding a religion, if that's what's going on. The Zendavesta was the result. When it was completed, he knew his only chance of success was to convince Darius Hystaspes, who it is admitted was his contemporary, of the wisdom of his great religious scheme, and secure for it his support. In this, he was at least successful, notwithstanding the efforts of all the learned classes, and especially the Chaldean and Persian magi, to perpetuate the more ancient fire-worshipping and astrological religion. It is true that the story of Zarathustra by Zerdusht does not mention Darius as his kingly friend and patron, but the name Gustasp, which was admitted is the same as Hystaspes, is mentioned. Not only was the Gustasp and Hystaspes one and the same person, and that person the royal convert of Zarathustra, but we have it stated on high Christian authority no less than Justin Clement of Alexandria, Electanius, thought to contain predictions concerning Christ, and it was called Hystaspes from the fact that such was the name of a Persian savant, under whose reign it was circulated. As we have shown, that the good, pious Christian fathers suppressed the name of that apocalyptic work, which was certainly the Zendavesta, and that also the name of this great medium author, Zarathustra, bringing out the inner medium is not quite the right word, because it wasn't calling in spirit possession and then letting the spirit take over in that way. Mediator, I'd go for that term. In view of the facts glated above, does it not appear that the Sibylline, the Jewish, and the Christian books have been largely borrowed from the Zendavesta of Zarathustra? And could any fact be made plainer than that Justin, Clement, and Lactantius all sought to conceal the fact that the early Christians were sun worshippers and regarded the Zendavesta as a sacred book. Giving thanks to God for the 11 good things does not mean that you worship these 11 good things. And let me add that because of 2 verses in Al-Quran 22 and in Surah 2, I think it is, and that alone, if it wasn't for sayings as well, in the Islamic world, they consider the Kanon Zerdusht to be people of the book. So they're given special status under actual Islamic rule. As in, they're insured by the government. They're not just permitted. They're, they have. I don't know how to articulate that too quickly, but I attach the highest significance to the testimony of Ammianus Marcellinus, the Roman historian, whose reputation for freedom from all sectarian or religious prejudice and for accuracy, fidelity, and partiality is universally conceded, who lived probably as late as the beginning of the 5th century. He says that one, Hystaspes, has studied astronomy with the Brahmins of India and had even informed the Magi of his ability to know the future. He was undoubtedly misled on this point by Justin, Clement, and Lactantius, who substituted the surname of Darius for that of the real person who had studied astronomy with the Brahmins of India. He undoubtedly refers to Zarathustra. Still later, the Byzantine history, Agathias, who lived as late as 582, knew of Hystaspes, who was a contemporary of Zoroaster. This shows that as late as the latter part of the 6th century, it was known that Zoroaster was the contemporary of Darius I, and that Darius I was Darius Hystaspes. We have the fact admitted by Christian theologians that Vatichinia Hystaspes, which was used by the early Christians, was most probably of heathen and not of Jewish or Christian production, because Judaism didn't exist at that point, obviously. And Judaism basically compiled books and accounts based on what happened before it, just as the Christians reworked other material. And there could have been a real Paul. It seems there really was a real Paul that showed up in the middle of the time of Apollonius. But what is, Saul? How many Sauls were there? A lot of Sauls. It has been further admitted that its author was probably a Gnostic, all of which points to Zoroaster and his religion as to its identification. But it is further admitted by some writers, and with the best reason, Thomas's Dictionary of Biography, article Gustasp, see also, that Gustasp has been identified with Darius I, surnamed Hystaspes. Thus, the communication of Zarathustra is not only confirmed as to the fact that Darius Hystaspes or Hydaspes preceded Cyrus in the succession of Persian kings, but leaves no room to question with the authenticity and truthfulness of his statements. With this correction of historical errors, all the other historical errors that have grown out of it are equally corrected and plainly intelligible. Now, do we need to have a spirit saying that there's such and such? It's like when people, they conjure, they pick up their they sit before their dark mirror flanked with candles to create a strobe effect, and I'm not saying I do this. That's not, I don't call it, they think that whatever they mention is whatever shows up. Now, if they imagine an interactive picture of something out of a book, okay, but is that anything more than psychological that's happening with people? Anyways. I claim, therefore, it is a demonstrated fact that Daniel, the so-called Jewish prophet, never did perform the wonders related of him at the courts of Nebuchadnezzar, Shazar, Darius, and Cyrus. Remember, Cyrus in Al-Quran is still Qarnayn. Or at least he's the best candidate for such a mention. And if you look at a lot of the stuff that's not historically proven that's said about him, it fits perfectly. But that if anyone did so, it was Zoroaster or Zarathustra, the great person, sage, prophet, and seer, the friend and confidential advisor of the great and good King Darius, and founder of the Astro-Ethriac and the preeminently spiritual religion embodied and taught in the Zendavesta, which obviously had errors if you look at the language, but are errors in transmission or the edited parts, because there's definitely different periods of it, different language. It's like when you look at the Bible's from different language periods, you can tell. How closely the Jewish plagiarist in the Book of Daniel has followed the writings of Zarathustra and the incidences of his life, we may never certainly know. And next year you may see in more detail, and every year I'm going to try to do something as long as I can with the Zoroastrian list. Followed the writings of Zarathustra and the incidences of life we may never certainly know, but that there is nothing original about it, and that is a plagiarism of some Chaldean or Persian narrative I have demonstrated. Again, certain things are factors for development. So if there's going to be a prophet or something like that, you'd expect that some of this stuff would be, happening again and again, right? I will now return to the communication and hasten to a close. The spirit tells us that he was known as Aronimar at the court of Cyrus. This fact not only explains why Zarathustra gave me that name rather than his own, but it is strikingly convincing of his identity as the Daniel of the Book of Daniel. It will be seen in Daniel 6:27 that it is said in the decree of Darius, by whose orders Daniel was cast into the lion's den, he delivereth and rescueth, and he worketh signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who hath delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. On account of that alleged deliverance from the lions, he was no doubt especially distinguished at the court of Cyrus, where his influence was unbounded. The name Aronimar was no doubt given him as a mark of a special respect. The root of that name, Ar, is the Chaldaic root of Ara, which probably meant lion, as did its Hebrew equivalent Ara, and ending as well as beginning the name Ar, On, Ar. The meaning of that name, no doubt, was the one saved from the lions, or the lion tamer. Not wishing me to understand the full import of his labors until he was through, he withheld his identity under that unhistorical designation. Okay, that this thing is lying, it's not this, and it's like, okay, I'm really this. And we'd question everything that someone like that testified if this was real life. He says that while at the court of Cyrus, I was in the position of a philosopher who, having reasoned upon the law of cause and effect, would stand in any position in life. He indicates in the most striking manner that the great fundamental principle of all his philosophical and theological system, before Socrates and Plato lived, and long before Descartes, Bacon, and Newton lived, Zoroaster inaugurated the inductive philosophy, and now he returns as a spirit after all those long centuries to state that fact. He tells us that he was a medium whose psychological power was so great that it not only influenced men, but the most savage beasts. And you noticed with my video last weekend that holding that turtle and chanting and reading scripture by it and all that, kind of bought a critter that was very shy, which means I couldn't keep it around and keep it used to me, or else I wouldn't have been able to release it. But it works, chanting and going over scripture with in front of animals. It's, I've recited Persian prayers in front of dogs and had dogs stop barking. And I'll share some of those Avestan prayers and such at some point. It was doubtless by the same mediumistic power that the materialized spirit hand wrote that warning on the walls of Belshazzar's banqueting hall. The spirit tells us that when he lived, at least 550 BCE, there was a religious teaching promulgated, which was attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, and then ancient Egyptian sage and lawgiver, which prophesied that a child should be born of a virgin, and that it was commonly believed at that time. Thus, then, was no Jewish prophecy, as had been pretended, but a prophecy of a Gentile, heathen. Zarathustra, in his communication, informs us that it was the phallic worship that preceded his Mithraic religion. That back of that was the astronomical and philosophical religion of Hermes Trismegistus, which even 500 years before the time of Zarathustra embodied what we call the inductive philosophy, of which Bacon was the great modern exemplar, and that away, far back, before that advanced philosophy, there was a Hindu Chaldaic civilization which took its rise at the base of the Himalayas. Besides that, there was a very ancient Phoenician religion. My stomach's growling, but I've just eaten. And that the chief idea of the two latter religions was the relations of heat and cold, and their effects upon men, and so on the crops on which they depended for food. All this indicated by the historical or traditional evidence that has been permitted to come down to us.